Hey guys, another week, another game dev vlog, and this week I've been making some more progress on Everybody at Its Universe, and this week started with adding the ability to have animated blocks in the game, and it seems to be working pretty well. On my computer it runs just fine, seeing a screen full of them. On my phone I notice a slight decrease in performance, but that's to be expected. The thing with animated blocks is, of course, you can't bake them onto a texture that you render later on like I do with chunks in the world. You have to render them on the fly. So anyway, as I was working on implementing that, I also worked on improving the way that blocks are stored in the game. It's still not final just yet, but we're starting to get an idea of how we want the code laid out for registering block types and managing any information associated with them. Anyway, the next thing that I worked on was the minimap rendering, and that one was actually pretty fun to do. It basically just involves two different canvases, one behind that's the actual world minimap, and then one in front that's transparent, that's for the players moving around. And the reason for that is, as I'm fading out player trails, it's a lot easier to just fade it to transparency rather than fading it to the block color behind it. There's a lot less computation needed, so it's better to just render two canvases. I do currently have one optimizational thing that's a little different than Everybody at Its. When it's closed, it does not compute player trails, because I feel like that is not really a good thing to do. So what it actually does is clear trails whenever you close the minimap. Now, after working on that, I transitioned over to working on stuff to do with the vector graphics, and that's where things are getting a bit complicated. And one of the first complications was that in some browsers, drawing an SVG onto a canvas is treated as an insecure operation, so it prevents you from reading pixel data from that canvas. And that was initially how I was computing shadows, and it is much faster to do it that way, but I did create a fallback method which just uses SVG filters to generate shadows, but it can't perform any optimizations like looking for full block duplicates. But that's fine, honestly, as a fallback method. It doesn't have to be as optimal as possible, it just needs to work. Then there's some complications with trying to figure out how we want to refer to textures. There are a couple different ways we could go about it. First of all, we'd like to avoid using a really long sprite sheet or anything like that. So we want the animations, or just block types in general, to be defined by groups rather than by positions. So essentially, in vector graphics, you can define a group, give it an ID, and then using some of the code for XML modification and then rendering that onto a canvas, I can move those around wherever I want to and then draw from that procedurally. So I don't need to pass in an offset or anything, that's generated in code automatically. Animations would use a similar system where they just are within a group and then there's frames defined within that group. And this sounds great in theory, but of course actually implementing it is a little bit trickier using the tools that we have available. So currently vector graphics are being made in Inkscape, which is about the best free SVG editing tool there is. And of course, there are some things that it doesn't do so great on, especially being efficient and being easy to optimize. We have started experimenting with SVG optimizers like SVGO, which is a pretty popular choice, but there's only so much it can do with certain things. Like, for example, Inkscape likes to create gradient transforms even when you're just scaling down a shape that has a gradient in it, rather than just moving the nodes, which would make it a lot more optimized. But of course, using the optimizers, they don't automatically try to apply those gradient transforms, because for all it knows, those gradient transforms could be doing something like a skew, which would be very difficult to simulate with movement, especially for any radial gradients. So there's all sorts of complications there that make it kind of tricky, not to mention the way that IDs work on those groups. And we can define IDs in Inkscape, but then passing it through an optimizer like SVGO, they usually group together all types of IDs as one option, whether or not to strip them or not. So you either have a bunch of extra IDs on tons of objects in order to keep the ones on the groups, or you have no IDs whatsoever. And yeah, it just doesn't work all that great. So I'm looking into other options of how to handle this kind of stuff, at least creating an intermediary option for now that would do any tweaks and compilation of multiple graphics together and giving them names and optimizing things automatically. But soon enough, I might be looking into the potential of building a tool to handle SVG creation a little more efficiently. Obviously, it's a bit of a big task, and it's not something that I just want to jump right into. Obviously, I got higher priority things to do, and we can make Inkscape work for now. Optimization shouldn't even be the main priority right now, because it's not like we're going to have that many blocks or smileys at the beginning that it's going to matter all that much. But as we go, I would like to have a much better tool to use to build these graphics. And I've been talking with Alex on ideas of what we would want out of a tool for something like that and trying to get ideas on how I would approach building it. And it actually seems pretty reasonable to do, but I'm gonna have to take it one step at a time and not rush into it because, as I said, I do have higher priority things to focus on. Anyway, other than all those things, the other stuff I've been doing is mostly just been talking with Luke on figuring out some physics stuff, and of course running demos for the EEU Alpha supporters on Patreon to be able to try out the game and see the progress that we're making. So overall, it's going fairly well, but there are certain roadblocks that are slowing things down, but we'll get through it, we'll figure out ways around it, and we're gonna make this game. So we're getting there one step at a time, no matter how long it takes. So anyway, I guess that is gonna have to be it for today. So as always, I do want to thank my contributors over on Patreon. If you want to check out my Patreon page for yourself, the link is down in the description below. And of course, I want to thank the Everybody at Its patrons as well. So yeah, I'll see you around. Goodbye.